It's nice to see everyone. I think I know most of you, but my name is Sarah Ewing, and I'm in charge of the adult programs here at the JCC. And we have such a special opportunity this morning with Oleksandra Kovalchuk. Yeah. So she reached out to me. She and her family are here fairly recently from Ukraine, and her son is in the preschool. And she has a very impressive background. As you know, she's going to be here talking about an overview of Ukrainian-Jewish art history, but I just wanted to give her the introduction that she deserves. Oleksandra is the acting director of the Odesa Fine Arts Museum, leader of the NGO Museum for Change that is fundraising to protect Ukrainian cultural institutions, an acting member of the Odessa City Council, and an activist and a volunteer. After the beginning of the military invasion, she arrived in Massachusetts with her husband and son. Since then, Oleksandra is raising awareness about Ukrainian culture and efforts of museums to protect Ukrainian heritage. During the past 8 months, Oleksandra has presented at the Heritage Museum and Gardens, Boston University, the Ogunquit Museum of American Art, the Peabody Essex Museum, the MFA, and the Museum of the Seven Gables. So I just really wanted to thank her for taking the time out of her busy schedule to be with us today, and I'm sure you will find her presentation very interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this beautiful morning here to hear about Ukrainian and Jewish stories in art. I've tried to prepare this presentation to make it kind of cheering, but it's hard, you know, it's hard because it's about Ukrainian history and Jewish history, which has been very full of tragedies, unfortunately, especially in the 20th century. And I want to start with a quick overview. Like Ukraine was divided between different countries throughout the period of time from 17th century to the collapse of Soviet Union, when Ukraine gained its independence finally. But during all of these centuries, it was constantly divided and between different countries, like Lithuania, like Austrian, Hungarian Empire, like Poland, Russia. And that is why history in different regions is a little bit different always. But still, the development of arts in all of Ukrainian territories, as in most of, I would say, Eastern European countries, was somewhere in 18th, then 19th century. And by the end of 19th century, it gained the most speed and been very, very powerful. So in Ukrainian territories, we have Jewish population everywhere. So Jewish artists would live in most of the cities of Ukraine. But today I want to speak a little bit more about Odessa, a little bit about Kiev, a little less about Lviv, because there it's a longer and different story. It wouldn't fit in 45 minutes, unfortunately. So if you will want, we will be able to do a follow-up thing. So I want to start with the Odesa Art School. It is very interesting because it was the only art school in Russian Empire where where there was no percentage norm for Jewish people to attend this art school. So basically, in most of other institutes, schools, etc., there was a limit of Jewish people who could attend. In the Odesa Art School, there wasn't. So generally, it was very appealing for children with talent to join the school to get education. And in the end of 19th century, like 1989, they made a deal with the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg that whoever receives the highest graduation diploma from Odesa Art School can go to the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg without exams. And over there was a percentage norm for Jewish people, but this was kind of loop for like a scheme to get into there for sure. That is why Odesa Art School was appealing not only for people from Odessa, but also from all the territory of Russian Empire at that time. And the thing that it was like this, I think that it is linked with the activeness of Jewish people in the history of Odessa, their proactive position in the community life of that time, and lobbyism, kind of a lobbyism that made it happen. So this is, unfortunately, I don't think it's very easy to see, but this is the teachers and some students of the school at 1880, and I just wanted to show you some statistics. Like this is Jewish students by years, and we see that it's nearly as many as the Orthodox, which was like 50% of population of Russian Empire was Orthodox, and in Odessa too. And then if we look at the next couple of years, like from 1900 to 1905, we will see that by the end, it would be even 64% of the students of the Odesa Art School who were Jewish. And this was amazing. And there was a lot of course, polemics. There were people, especially in these years, in Russian Empire, the movements, anti-Semitic movements, were fueled and paid by Russian government, Russian Empire government, by the police of Russian Empire. And of course, there were people that were not happy that Odesa Art School has such a privilege for Jewish students who can also go without exams to the Supreme School of Art of the Russian Empire. That led to a huge development of arts in Odessa also. In the Odessa Art School, for example, Kandinsky used to go. And not everybody knows that Kandinsky's family lived in Odessa for many, many years. And he's been linked with Odessa very much. He spent a lot of time here. And we had plenty of Jewish artists who would go to this school, and then instead of going to Imperial Academy of Art, they would go to Paris. And they were an important part of avant-garde movement at that moment. For example, this is Amshe Nürnberg, and his works, The Batters. Of course, you can see that he was influenced by Picasso, and he was actually in touch with Picasso. He worked in the same workspace in Paris with Marc Chagall, and he was friends with Matisse, with everybody who worked at that time. And he was very avant-garde looking, but then or for example, this one is definitely inspired by Matisse. You can see here some references to him. He was actively looking for his style, but then after 1917, unfortunately, he decides to go back to Odessa. He becomes inspired by communist revolution, and he even joins the committee that basically robs art from the houses that were left during the time when Odessa was becoming red and white, like when Red Army was taking Odessa. All of these empty houses were basically robbed. So he was in the committee that was going to these houses, taking this art, and then dividing it between the museums. And he stays in Soviet Union, and he continues to work in Odessa and then sometimes in Moscow. And here on this work of art, we can see how his style develops. Basically, from searching his avant-garde path, he is going to the propaganda style thing, like it's called bourgeois science. Joining this propaganda in Soviet Union against capitalism, against entrepreneurs, against personal wealth. And eventually, after the World War II, we can see, unfortunately, it's not very nice, easy to see, but over here, you can see that from someone being very talented, being friend of Picasso, of Matisse, being recognized by these people, he becomes someone that, someone who is attending evening school of practicing art could do this. It's hardly you can call it an art. And that's what happened to many artists in Soviet Union who managed to survive 30s and World War II, but they couldn't preserve their identity and their artistic style and their right of self-expression. And here is Stenfield Friedman. Their path is very similar. He also was graduated from the Odesa Art School and then he went to Paris. And he was friend of George Braque, he was friend of Picasso again, and he was part of the Salon in Paris, which is the highest, the supreme recognition for the artist to be a part of Salon. He could show there as many works as he wanted, while he was a very young artist at that time. But unfortunately, at 1917, his mother is ill in Odessa. He goes back, and he also follows the lead of communist revolution. He believes in it, and he starts working with communists. And this is one of his works in 1990. Oh gosh, sometimes part of them do not upload. And this is his work also from 50s. Which is also something that you can find on flea markets, something that is nice, but it's nothing compared to who he was in Paris when he was recognized again by all of these artists that right now cost millions and billions of dollars for their art. He was a director of one of the Odesa museums, and he was a teacher for a very long time. And the only way he could preserve his artist identity was to teach new generation of artists in Odessa. And actually, when we're looking when we will be able to see exposition of the Odesa Fine Arts again, we will see how his impact is seen through his students going in 50s, 60s, 80s, and even 90s. And he did a great contribution towards the Odesa Art School. And now going from Odessa for a little bit to Kiev, what was going on there. The thing is that 1917, that when in Russian Empire revolution begins, in Kiev, the intellectual establishment decides that Ukraine wants to be an autonomy, that it wants to be separated from Russian Empire. And this new government, the head of this new government is Mikhail Grushenski over here in this picture. And he, together with his friends, Ukrainian artists, and for example, this one, we will talk about him a little bit right now, a Jewish Ukrainian artist, they established a Ukrainian Academy of Art because they've been willing to have an Academy of Art in Ukraine, not to be obliged to send artists to Moscow or St. Petersburg as the only path and the only chance to get the higher education. And they wanted an Academy of Arts in Kiev. So finally, they established it. And one of the reasons why Ukrainian state didn't survive next 4 years is that it was, unfortunately, it was led by intellectuals, by very bright people, by historians, by philosophers, who were just unable to sustain this military situation when they really needed a lot of power and manpower and military power to keep the state independent. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, but Academy of Arts was established, and it actually survived and it exists still. Over here, we see a lot of main Ukrainian artists like Oleksandra Kovalchuk here, like Fedor Krichevsky and Vasil Krichevsky, who would create the base for the development of Ukrainian art school during 20s and 30s, even though most of them from this picture would be executed by Soviet authorities, unfortunately. So I want to speak about Abram Manevich, unfortunately, and it's just in PDF, sometimes it skips some pictures. So this one, for example, he was an avant-gardist, and he had his own view. He was impacted by Cézanne. He had some time that he spent in Europe. He was well received in Europe, but then he decides to go back to Ukraine, and this is a little bit the difference, that he decides to go to Kiev to work in this Academy of Art, to become one of the teachers in the Academy of Art. But in 1919, unfortunately, Abram Manevich's son was killed in the pogrom in Kiev. At that year, during these wars that were happening around Ukraine, it was different powers. It was Red Army of Communist power. It was White Army of Russian Empire. And there was Ukrainian army, and there were also anarchists who were trying to gain power when there is this mess. Basically, there is always someone who wants to gain power. And in all of this mess, there's been a lot of weapons, a lot of men who were ready to fight. And during this time, in this conquest for power, there was a pogrom in Kiev that happened, unfortunately, and his son was killed. And after that, he immediately immigrates to Europe and then to the United States. So he died in New York in 50s. And I hope that, yeah, this is his picture. And this is from, actually I have a mistake here, it's 1927. His picture from Paris. And what is interesting in this story for me, he's wearing a Ukrainian vyshyvanka, a Ukrainian shirt. And he was always very connected to local Ukrainian art, even though he was a Jewish person. And even though his son was killed in pogrom, he never blamed Ukraine on this, or Ukrainian people, or the establishment of that state. He blamed that particular Ottoman, the anarchist, who created it. And what was the reason for that, I can also explain a little bit later. So he was still very sentimental towards Ukraine and Ukrainian traditions. This is his picture from the New York exhibition in '36. Then I want to speak a little bit about Manuel Shechman. He's one of the artists who went to Academy of Arts in 20s and beginning of 30s, and he was among the first students that get to learn from Ukrainian artists and Jewish artists too. Because after the revolution in Soviet Union, there was a moment when they needed to say to Ukrainians, you are allowed to have your culture, you are allowed to write books and poems in Ukrainian, you are allowed to educate your art school. And that same thing was with the Jewish people. Jewish people were very fast emancipated because there were no more restrictions as they were in Russian Empire. And in Kiev there is a very strong movement of Jewish artists who are creating their own establishments or own schools. and Academy of Arts, of course, Jewish Ukrainian artists work there. So Shechtman is one of the first students, and his art is actually, now we have, I don't know what it is. This is working.
Here. Maybe. She's not Jewish. I'm not Jewish. Sorry.
I can just tell me when to move the slides.
So this is Manuel Shechtman, after the pogrom, the work of 1926. It's actually like a reconstruction of pogroms that were happening during 1905. And personally, I love his style. Unfortunately, not many works of art by him are available online, actually quite limited. And there is a reason for that, because as he was a student of all of these Ukrainian artists, who were then executed by Soviet KGB. And he and his friends were also, most of his friends were also executed. He was very lucky not to be executed by communists for being avant-garde, for being infigurative, for not to join the social realistic school, basically the school of realism, and he had this unique style. He also, interesting fact that he spent a lot of time in Crimea, depicting Ukrainian, and Crimea was Crimea Tataran and Ukrainian, and there was a very mixed population. Russian population was the smallest over there, always. And there's been a lot of villages, Jewish villages in Crimea. And he had a series of works about Crimean Jewish villages, which most of them didn't survive, not only because of the Holocaust and the occupation by Nazis, but also because of the communist vision of development. Even before World War II, they first had this idea of having these Jewish villages everywhere, but then they were just destroyed and people were displaced. And like here, this one is called Displaced People. It speaks especially about these villages that were forcibly displaced through the territory of Soviet Union. And but his style was, for me, very interesting, and he picked up a lot from Kovalchuk, one of the leading Ukrainian artists of 20s. He and his family was executed in 1937. And to survive, Manuel Shechtman, he decided to go to Moscow, because it was always easy to get lost in bigger city when KGB could lose your track. But he worked there not as an artist, but more like a decorator for some, decorating some demonstrations or things like that. And then when Germans invaded Soviet Union, he became one of the volunteers. He went to the Red Army, and he got missing somewhere around Moscow in the beginning, in the first year of invasion of Nazis to Soviet Union. And speaking about pogroms, I want to go back a little bit. And this work of art is by Vasil Silvestrov, who is not Jewish. And he wasn't Jewish at all, he was Ukrainian, but he lived in Vinnytsia and worked there for a very long time. And he had a lot of Jewish friends, and it was a very basic thing, because there was a little bit more integration in between different communities in the territories of modern Ukraine than it was in Europe, for example, where Jewish community was more like localized. He, of course, for him, all of these memories about pogroms, about things that would happen, were very tragic, and he wanted to express about it. And this work of art, it depicts streets of Vinnytsia, and this neighborhood was called Jerusalimka, like Little Jerusalem, Little Jerusalem. And he speaks here about the pogrom that is about to begin. And we see here that people are already telling that you should hide, like this information is already spreading. Oh gosh, the most important part is missing, but I will try to show it here. If you can see over here on this part of the slide, there is a Russian icon, an Orthodox icon. And there's a lot of icons over here in the crowd. So the basic thing, most of the programs in Russian Empire would start with the demonstration of Orthodox going with these icons, and then it would get to the pogrom. And this is it was important for us as for museum, when we had this work of art in our exposition, to speak about these myths about Orthodox Church and Orthodox people of Russian Empire being bright and faithful and always right. And we did a lot to work with this myth and to speak about the tragic violence that happened towards not only Jewish communities, but of any non-Russian communities that happened during Russian Empire. And another interesting thing here, particularly, is this. These are the policemen. These are Russian Empire authorities, the policemen, that are part of the crowd that is going to commit all of these crimes. They are going to kill, rape, and destroy. That is what they're going to do, and police is a part of that. And unfortunately, I hear a lot about Ukraine as bad history of Jewish-Ukrainian relationships. The truth is that Ukrainian-Jewish relationships, in many cases, was a good story. But the story of Russian Empire and its fueling of anti-Semitism that was happening, and their responsibility for all of the pogroms that made most of the families who came here in the beginning of 20th century, made them go and relocate to the United States, to other countries of the world, to Canada, etc., etc. It was fueled by the Russian Empire, by the state, and police of Russian Empire was always part of that. Here is a study to this work. Here you can see a little bit better. These are the policemen again. This is the icons that they are using. And over here, seems like he was testing an idea of this being crest, trying to stop them, to tell them that what they're doing is wrong. And now from this part, I want to go back to Odessa. This used to be one of the directors of the Odesa Art Museum, Emsky. He was from Jewish family. He was a great intellectual. He was a believed communist, and he became a director of the museum in 20s. He was executed in 30s. He was executed in 37. He was accused of being spy of, at the same moment, Japan and Italy. That would, in Soviet Union, in all of these Red Terror cases, people would always be spies of like 3-4 countries at the same time. They would be Jewish and at the same time Nazi. That was like in Ukraine also. Like recently, Lavrov said that Israel is a Nazi state. So this all sometimes mixes up in this propaganda views. So we have in our exposition his little work of art over here, and he himself made a lot of efforts to make this part of our museum's collection. These works by Jewish artists from 20s and from Nuremberg, Freiman, whoever I was speaking about. He did a lot he contributed even his own collection to the museum. And his input is very important. And here is Solomon Kishinyovsky. It's also one of the works from our collection. He also graduated from the Odesa Art School. He was a very, very nice colorist, and he did a lot of beautiful landscapes of Odessa streets. He went to study also in St. Petersburg Academy of Art and in Italy, Germany, France. Then he returned to Russian Empire, and he stayed in Soviet Union. Unfortunately, he didn't immigrate. And he was performing arts in schools, in Odessa Art School, until the invasion of Germans and Romanians. And there is a tale that this is also a work from his series from 1905. And it is, for me personally, important because when I've joined the Odesa Fine Arts Museum, we had some works by Kishinyovsky in our exposition, but we had nothing about... Okay, sorry. So we had nothing about pogrom series, and it's one of his most famous series by Kishinyovsky. And for me it was important not only to have one of his most famous series, but to also have an opportunity to speak about pogroms that happened in Odessa, because there was also this Soviet and post-Soviet propaganda that in Lviv there was a pogrom. And it seems like in Odessa, no, it never happened. So people were blocking this memory, and it was made on purpose. So, no, that's not me, I think. That's something with the computer. Sarah will return and maybe help us. So I really wanted to remind visitors of the Odesa Fine Arts Museum and to speak about it during guided tours too, during programming. And just one day, a person comes to our museum and says, I want to contribute this work of art by Kishinyovsky to the collection of the museum. And we were like, wow, this is a miracle, and we were really thankful it was part of our exhibition. And another interesting thing that in Ukrainian museums, there was never there was a problem with exhibiting Jewish art. It was always an important part of any museum's exhibition. So unfortunately he dies in Odessa ghetto after when it is created by Nazis in 1941. And we know the last trace of Kishinyevsky in Odessa is near the Odesa Fine Arts Museum, because he was literally going through the street. That is the only thing that we know for sure, that he went there through the Odesa Fine Arts Museum that had about 20-30 works of art by him in the exhibition. And now I will speak about the Kiev Memorial of Babi Yar. I'm sure you heard of the largest mass grave, mass executions location in Ukraine. And there was, after 1945, there was nothing. For Soviet Union, that started to be anti-Semitic right away from 1945, and it was increasing by 1953 when they started the case of doctors that could lead to, I think, extermination of Jewish population of Soviet Union, and everybody were so happy that Stalin died, and it never happened. But from the Soviet Union officials, the place of beggars was never recognized, and there was nothing. However, people used to come there every year to bring flowers to this place, and they were usually arrested by police and KGB. That's what just happened. But in 1965, when there was kind of a warmth towards everything in Soviet Union, there's been series of demonstrations where people were saying there's got to be something on this space. We've got to recognize this tragedy that happened here. We cannot just build here a park and swings for children, etc. So they've put on this stone. However, on this stone, they said, a monument to the Soviet people murdered during the occupation of Kiev would be established here. So they had never acknowledged that it was Jewish people, it was Soviet people. And then, same year, they've made a contest for the monument that will be there. And one of the participants is Kovalchuk and Linichenko. It's a husband and wife that were working together. They are extremely talented, and they've suggested this kind of memorial with this kind of walls. And in these walls, they would show that there's been integrated part with some Jewish symbols to acknowledging Jewish people who's being the most part of this tragedy, the most part of the victims who were executed there. But it never happened. They selected a different offer and created this typical Soviet style monument with this kind of conquerors with absolutely different vibe, not commemorizing, not acknowledging a tragedy, but being very strong, and obviously we're suffering, but we're suffering in a strong way. And it's always like this in Soviet monuments. And still you can see how many people came there, brought flowers, and every year there would be a lot of people who would come there to bring flowers, and still they were, even in 80s, they were mostly arrested and sent away by police, and it became a place of commemorization only in 90s. And only now we finally are working on proper memorialization of Babi Yar and on a new big memorial complex that should have been started building, if not the invasion of Russian Federation right now. And the final Jewish artist I want to speak about is Oleksandra Kovalchuk. He was also a director of the Odesa Fine Arts Museum. He started his career in 60s and 70s. He was among non-conformists, and sorry, not 60s and 70s, in 80s. His teachers were from 60s and 70s. This is one of his works. It's Buddha Mamai. He used to use a lot of references to different religions, different histories, different humanists or intellectuals, writers, poets from history of humankind, Jewish history and non-Jewish history. It's very interesting to look at his works of art when you know all of that, because you immediately can see what he used, what he quoted, how he mixed it, and what is the point. Like here, he is mixing a traditional Ukrainian Cossack Mamai, the traditional Ukrainian hero who was like a naive art very widespread in Ukrainian cities. And he was also an activist, and this is his picture from Maidan when there was a revolution of dignity in 2013 to 2014. He would go there nearly every day. He did a lot of artworks inspired by this revolution, and this was the turning point that, in a way, was our final breakthrough from Russian Empire, Russian Federation, Soviet Union, all at once. And it's like today Ukraine is fighting all of these three entities at the same time. We're like fighting in different times and in different spaces. And he was an important part of all of that. And at that time, even though he was Jewish, he had a green card. He used to live here for a couple of years, but then he returned to Ukraine. And this was his choice. He wanted to stay in Ukraine, he wanted to work in Ukraine, he wanted to be part of this community. He became a director of the museum in Odessa to elevate art, to speak about the Ukrainian art history. He was very bright and talented. And this is him also reading poetry, Ukrainian poetry from 20s on the stage of Maidan. And he was a very important spiritual leader, not spiritual, intellectual leader for many, many Ukrainians. And another thing, when I hear now that in Ukraine there are Nazis, etc., and I'm like, yeah, sure, we have president who is Jewish, we have leaders, social leaders who are Jewish, and of course we're Nazi at the same time. And when he started working in the Odesa Fine Arts Museum, there's been a pro-Russian party, they were accusing him of stealing works, copying works from the collection, and selling the original works. So he had a perfect sense of humor. He created a series of works that were called copies. So he copied first a collection of the Odesa Fine Arts Museum. You can see it's not very close. Sometimes some people not very trained could see the difference between the original and the copy. And eventually, when he copied enough of works from the Odesa Fine Arts collection, he started copying other works, like Caravaggio. And I'm sorry, there is no this work, I'm so disappointed. So the main, I apologize, the main idea of this work that he gave to the Odesa Fine Arts Museum, and it was on purpose. He gave this particular work because it's David with the head of Goliath. And he wanted the Odessa Museum collection to have this particular work. So we will have in public exhibition the work of art that would remind everyone that no matter how big and scary Goliath is, he can be conquered. And with this quote from Oleksandra Kovalchuk, like the Ukrainian-Jewish artist from recent times, from times of independence Ukraine, I will finish this presentation and I'll be ready to reply your questions. Sarah is working on.
No.
Alright, talk loud then. I'm assuming that these are all the Odessa Museum of Fine Arts still, and we've heard in the news that all the museums are being ransacked by the Russians, and how about this museum?
As Odessa, luckily, and let's hope that it will stay this way, wasn't occupied, our collection, as collections of all other museums, were, first of all, were taken off the walls, and most museums were closed for the most time. Right now, we have some exhibitions of contemporary Ukrainian art, so museum is working and trying to reflect on genocide that is happening right now on our watch. And for the museums that were on occupied territories or are right now on occupied territories, they are mostly looted by Russian forces. And when I have to constantly speak with many intellectuals in the United States and around the world about the greatness of Russian culture, about their great achievements, etc., etc. And all of this museum establishment is right now working as part of this governmental machine, of this propaganda machine. And people from Hermitage go to all of these occupied territories. They coordinate the looting of arts, relocation of arts, and I really honestly doubt that it will be possible for Ukraine to get what they took back. Yeah.
First place, my mother was born in Odessa, and she escaped the pogroms in the early 1900s. She came to America. So that's my past. But a lot of the artists, are there any women? I noticed. Yeah.
It's a good question.
Did everyone hear the question? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is if there were Jewish women artists. There were in 20s mostly. In Odessa Art School, if I will go back to in this presentation, I will show you this interesting part. So here you see +8, +3, +2. Those are women. Yeah, this you see 85 +8 +3 +2. So time from time there were women. There were classes. Sometimes they didn't get to the reports actually, but there was a full class for women in Odessa Art School, for example. But on reports they didn't show it because it was still Russian Empire. Women were not so emancipated. But we have some women artists from 20s that are mostly Ukrainian, some Jewish Ukrainian. And from Lviv, we have more women actually. So if I was speaking about the territories of eastern territories of Ukraine, there would be a little bit more Jewish Ukrainian women artists. But basically, at the time of Russian Empire, it wasn't so widespread as everywhere still in Europe. And at the same time, in 20s, there's been a huge wave of emancipation, and there's been a lot of women going to art school in Kiev, in Odessa, everywhere. Unfortunately, a lot of them were executed, and a lot eventually died during Holocaust, which altogether with the complicated moments in Ukraine, our archives, especially cultural archives, were destroyed by communists or stolen or burned. And in the end of 30s, actually, a lot of this art that I've shown you, a lot of this art was destroyed. And these works by Shaftman that I showed you, they survived by a miracle. They were part of special storage of the Kiev Museum. And it was a miracle and heroic actions by people who worked there that these works of art survived, because they were usually burned, and they were prepared to be burned, actually. So we don't have these archives because of the communists, and we don't have then these archives because of the World War II that was happening mainly on the territory of Belarus and Ukraine, not on territory of Russia, modern Russian Federation. It was mostly on Ukrainian and Belarusian territories. And so everything was just burned due to shelling, bombing, combats, etc. And then after that, again, it was whatever there was left was often relocated by Soviets. So sometimes we just cannot find enough information. And even right now, as this invasion is going, what happened is that a lot of Ukrainian researchers went away from Ukraine in February and March. And they've received fast positions in different European institutions, in some American institutions. And right now there are a lot of scholars that are working on archives and archival materials that are in different countries of the world and that were never studied properly. So I feel that in the next 5-10 years we will find out more. And that's when we should find out more about women, for sure.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oleksandra.